Chapter 491. The battle between Hell and the Abyss in the short term actually has no true meaning of victory. After all, for both sides of the war, what they really aim to do is to completely engulf the other and thereby become the sole entity again, not an easily achievable goal. Under such circumstances, once the collision of power begins, it likely won't stop, not even with the death of those demon gods who invaded the Nine Hells. Unless one realm is utterly destroyed, the war will never end. Therefore, what the Serpent of the Central Court refers to as accomplishing its mission in one fell swoop does not mean ending the war itself, but rather ensuring it progresses in a way that better serves the interests of the Nine Hells. After all, for the weaker side, the most important thing is to control the intensity and scale of the conflict. Just like now, when the entire force of Tartarus presses down upon the Nine Layers, and Moya, who temporarily bears its power, personally enters the fray, the pressure on Hell is unparalleled. Even if Hell manages to repel the opponent this time, if they don't find another outlet for the conflict between the two realms, the pressure from the Abyss will only continue unabated, not diminished by the death or injury of the demon gods. If one defends for too long, they are bound to fail. The Abyss can afford many losses, but if the Nine Hells lose just once, it would severely damage their vital essence. A second loss could bring them perilously close to destruction. So from the start, this battle was never about completely annihilating the newcomers, but about how to use the chaotic thinking of Tartarus to shift the battlefield down a notch. To bring it to a domain where the Abyss might lose countless times, but Hell could also afford many losses, and there, accumulate the wins little by little, apply reason, accumulate experience, innovate, and eventually turn around the situation between the two sides. Let's hope so. Resisting the pressure of Tartarus is not easy, and like today's event, I do not wish for a second occurrence. A deep voice resonated once more but vanished without waiting for a response. However, the Serpent of the Central Court wasn't surprised by this, for at this moment, Asmodeus was under far more pressure than it. But it, too, had not been idle. Even as it had been speaking, wisps of power continually seeped out, quietly disappearing into the void surrounding it through some connection. The amount was not great. Each time, only a little was released, reflecting on the faraway, ever-forming and dissipating temporal bubbles, indicating their position had subtly shifted, appearing to draw closer to the body of the serpent. However, given such a vast scale, even just a little was significant enough to be noticeable in reality. If Moya hadn't been distracted by other matters, she would have been able to detect the changes here, even if she hadn't been concentrating fully before. But there are no what-ifs in reality. For the current Mother of Demons, not only does she have more important tasks at hand, but she also firmly believes in the power descending from the Abyss. With the supreme power of Tartarus at her side, Moya is confident that she has thoroughly anchored the space-time around the Great Serpent. It might force its way out, but it could not circumvent the blockade without her knowledge. At least, judging by the ancient serpent's previous space-time abilities, it couldn't. So naive after all. But then again, considering her mental age, she is indeed very young. Mused the Serpent of the Central Court. Despite being one of the primordial Titan deities, her actual understanding might not even surpass that of the newer gods from the Third Era. Sleeping for too long has its drawbacks. Shaking its head slightly, the Serpent of the Central Court refocused on the task at hand. Around it, the overflow of power continued, drifting downward, bit by bit, into the deeper layers of spacetime in a very natural manner. Nevertheless, any manipulation of these powers would trigger a corresponding reaction from the power of the Abyss that had locked down around the ancient serpent. But it didn't need to do anything. Because within the Nine Hells, there was a beacon. As though drawn by some instinct, these scattered powers moved steadily and naturally towards it. All was going smoothly, albeit the time required might be a bit long, with no unexpected events arising. After a while, though, the Serpent of the Central Court suddenly turned to look towards a direction in the Abyss. Although some distance away, it seemed as if someone was approaching. No, not approaching, he was merely observing this place through some means. It was not his own ability but rather some property of the Abyss. The assimilation of foreign power by Tartarus remains as extensive as ever, although it has incorporated the Kingdom of Flames as part of itself, even using it to nurture a demon god. there are still powers that haven't been fully assimilated. Now, they have resonated and transmitted some images over there. An outsider deity, entering the abyss at this time, I wonder what their purpose is. After observing for a while, the ancient serpent lost interest in these matters. As mentioned before, as the demon gods were born one after another, the many flaws of the abyss were rectified. Thus, as the embodiment of the third layer of hell, the serpent of the central court couldn't freely observe every corner of Tartarus anymore. Even though it sensed the presence of a newcomer, it couldn't precisely identify who they were. Chapter 492. But no matter who he was, he couldn't possibly affect the outcome of the struggle between the two realms. So at this juncture, the ancient serpent didn't pay any attention to his emotions. If he escaped in time, then he could consider himself lucky. If he remained there once the conflict between the realms was over, hell might not do much to him. After all, even a temporary victory by the Nine Hells would not justify entering a region still shrouded in the power of the abyss for the sake of one unknown deity. But the demon gods would be a different matter. By that time, whether he could leave or not, only heaven would know. Far from the center of the abyss, in the chaos-colored void, layers lie scattered like stars across a chessboard. Some are large, some small, and each radiate differently colored lights. It's as if they correspond with the sky above, forming a starry sky below all worlds. The abyss is truly a wondrous place. Before today, I had no idea there existed such a world beyond the present one. Standing in a dark red world, Helios felt some emotion. After a long journey, the god of sun had found his previous understanding of this place to be somewhat mistaken. Inside Tartarus, those overlapping layers were not merely arranged according to the spatial concept of up and down. Even on the same plane, there seemed to be more than one layer. At this moment, he was in another layer, entwined with flames. This was the seventh layer he'd come across following the direction of the noise, and also the one that seemed weakest in power. Yes, even if the layers on the same plane appeared to have similar characteristics, like being covered in lava and fire, their strength varied greatly. Apart from that first layer at the center, which was the most powerful, the outer ones had much less, without any discernible pattern. Some were stronger, some weaker, seemingly randomly derived. So to describe his position more accurately, the god of sun simply tagged them with numbers. Since he was in the 303rd layer down from the top, and this was the seventh layer he had encountered, he named it the 303-7th abyssal plane. At the moment, Helios was inside it. He had decided not to go any further. As the closer he got, the more voices he faintly heard from that direction, letting the god of sun sense that something was not quite right. Where was this place? It was inside the body of primordial god Tartarus, the core beyond the world. Any voices that could transmit from here must be the result of deity-level power. And the noises coming from that direction didn't seem to be made by one individual. Helios even had a premonition that it might be a battle. A battle in the abyss. This was not an amusing prospect. So the sun chose to temporarily stop here, also taking advantage of the existence of the 303-7th layer to conceal his traces. He planned to stay for a while, ideally waiting for the commotion in the distance to cease for a moment, then approach covertly to see what exactly had happened there. As for retreating directly, it was something Helios hadn't considered. Even nowadays, the undying chaotic gods were often very rash. It was precisely because this was the abyss that the god of sun might not have chosen to wait here. However, that was what he initially thought, but when Helios truly entered the 303-7th layer of the abyss, his previous plan was instantly overturned. Because the god of sun suddenly realized that the smoke formed by the burning flames here had created a massive illusion that seemed to reflect an occurrence from somewhere else. It was not from an objective perspective, but rather a subjective view of a life form. Helios could even see the non-human-like arms of the perspective's owner and a huge chainsword that looked like a divine artifact. It seemed to be in a place that was extremely similar to the material realm, except there were no sun and moon, and it was exceedingly desolate. Following the viewpoint of this unknown life form, Helios also saw more than one distinctly different life form, and even across the vast distances of space, he could feel the powerful forces transmitted through the vision. Each one was no less powerful than he was, some even more so, and yet the sun god had never seen them before. But this was not the reason for his astonishment. After all, it was just a vision, and no one knew where it was occurring or whether it was real. But when he saw a familiar figure, Helios was completely certain that the place shown in the vision was still the abyss. Because that figure, who summoned storms, was all too familiar to him. Although it seemed to have undergone some changes, it was not enough to prevent the sun god from recognizing it. The god of meteorology, Crius, a prisoner confined to the abyss by King Zeus, was at this moment in battle or perhaps a siege with the owner of this perspective. His divine body was severely damaged, and even the recovery had slowed down. When he had previously been imprisoned in the sun, Helios had seen him being beaten severely by his own father god. But even during those most dangerous moments, the god of meteorology had never looked so disheveled. So, due to some spatial temporal miracle that I do not yet understand, a distant scene has been reflected here? It seems understandable. After all, the master of this perspective is emanating a flame of destruction. Perhaps the entire 303rd layer of the abyss is somehow connected to it. Making a judgment effortlessly, Helios quickly accepted this outcome. However, what followed was a sigh of relief for his caution. Incredible, the abyss has actually given birth to native deities, if they truly are deities. Perhaps the gods of the abyss are just like that. After all, the world beyond is always different from the material world. It's understandable if they turned out this way. But looking at it this way, maybe the Father God wasn't joking, and the Hecatonchires really aren't the offspring of the Heavenly Father. A strange thought arose and was then suppressed by Helios. It was just speculation. After all, even the primordial sea god could give birth to an oddity like the Father of Monsters. Under the watch of the former Heavenly Father, Mother Earth should not have borne offspring with the irrational abyss. Nevertheless, today's discovery could literally shake all the gods of the material world. Life existed even in the abyss they considered a prison, and they were even besieging the deities imprisoned here. Whether it was solely directed at the god of meteorology or equally against all the gods of the material world, Helios had yet to ascertain. But his choice to stop here was no doubt the right one. Perhaps soon, another entity capable of influencing the situation would emerge in the material world. The good news is that's a headache for King Zeus. The bad news is they don't have brains, and they seem to fight with a reckless abandon. This world is still too mysterious, like the mysterious person who once briefly fought with the goddess of Hellfire during the Great Flood and claimed to come from hell. Unfortunately, I neither have a way to contact these unknown strong beings, nor dare I seek their allegiance. Shaking his head, Helios was now sure that the location from where the previous disturbance emanated was probably this battlefield. With that in mind, there was no need for him to continue forward. Gaia was probably not here, and besides, this place was too dangerous. Death was not an outcome, but being trapped here was not an interesting prospect. With this thought, the inclination to retreat began to rise in Helios's heart. His spirit suddenly invigorated. The sun god noticed that the situation reflected in the vision seemed to have changed. Although he couldn't hear any sounds or feel a clearer presence, Crius clearly exhibited a look of surprise amidst the siege. Chapter 493. Sacrifice and the Hell's second layer hidden high above. The silver mirror hung suspended in the air, no longer easily accessible to Mephisto. Its weight had become increasingly terrifying, and it continued to grow heavier every second. Dark serpents circled around it, ceaselessly moving through space, silently drawing in threads of gray matter, slowly and steadily increasing its volume. Despite his calm demeanor, Mephisto's body trembled unconsciously. This was not out of fear but merely a natural instinctive reaction of life. Mephisto, having leaped several ranks from an ordinary great devil to the lord of an entire level of hell in a short time, grew stronger, but his body had yet to transform. Just as a native deity needed a long time to recover once their divine body was completely eradicated, it was not an easy task to form a body that matched his current powers. Like the former god of meteorology, the reason he could stay active in the world soon after his transformation was due to his crafty use of his legacy. After infusing his origin into the first layer of hell, Crius directly sculpted his current body based on his old divine physique, which is why he still bore no demonic traits to this date, looking no different from before. A deity's body is closely tied to their power. Theoretically, as a god of hell, he should bear hell's characteristics. Even if not a pair of curved horns, his eye color at least should be leaning towards that of the Lord of the Nine Hells. But because he took such shortcuts, none of this happened. However, this likely won't be the case in the future, as Crius, the last vestige of the Titan gods, is probably going to turn to ash today. And the body that he will spend a long time reconstructing will inevitably bear the unique traits of the Nine Hells. How beautiful, yet terrifying. But to achieve sufficient results in one strike, the more powerful it is, the better, he whispered to himself. At this moment, the place where Mephisto stood was very particular. It was close to the border between the second and third layers of hell. This was not an actual location because, theoretically, each layer of hell is situated below the previous one. However, the special spatial rules of the mythic world make the conceptual below often not equivalent to the physical one. Therefore, by the will of the World Lord, although Mephisto's location was high relative to the distant battlefield, in reality, his orientation was from below, leading up toward the roaring tunnel. The reason for choosing such a position was obvious, though Mephisto couldn't determine how terrifying this long-planned strike would be. By using the wipeout of at least one demon god as a benchmark, he could roughly estimate. So causing harm to the enemies was one aspect, and preventing the explosion from erupting within the Nine Hells was another. What's more, the Overlord of the Middle Court had specifically instructed him to aim the final point outside the world. So along this direction, by focusing the main force on the 4 demon gods and then ascending up to attack the other 2 demon gods still sleeping in the first layer, ending by dispersing the aftermath outward, this spot was indeed the most suitable location. In silence, time continued to pass, with only the distant rumbling occasionally sounding. Around the silver mirror, the circling black serpents took on an increasingly refined and complete form. At one moment, it seemed as though a threshold had been reached. Even as gray mists continued to pour in, there was no further change. No force could accumulate without limit, and at that moment, Mephisto knew it was time to act. Come then. As if a mortal were moving a mountain, with the surface of the mirror slightly adjusted due to the influence of the devil's power, droplets of sweat streamed down Mephisto's cheeks. Yet Mephisto was oblivious to this, and as the last half-hour passed, he prepared to put an end to it all. To wield the power of life and death is a wonderful feeling. Although you are also born divine, there is one thing that's no different between you and me, he said, a smile curling at the corner of his mouth as he bowed slightly toward the silver mirror. For instance, both I and you will face death. Rip. A massive chain sword grazed Crius's skin, leaving behind a deep trail of blood. But he didn't dare engage in combat and quickly retreated from the divine artifact's master. The blood was controlled so it didn't fall but instead maintained its form with the power of the divine. The battles in hell enriched the former Titan god with much knowledge, such as how to maintain combat effectiveness through a long fight with no rest. He even found amusement in the struggle, thinking that if he could do it all over again, he would fare much better. Whoosh! Seeing the chainsword's master in pursuit, Crius continued dodging. The former god of meteorology, having been blown up 3 times, was well experienced with this. He could assure that although this demon god, engulfed in annihilation demon flame, had fallen more dramatically than he did, it would do the same again if given the chance. To kill an enemy at the cost of grave damage to oneself. A concept that in the language of later video games would be called wide-range AoE, turned into a single target effect. Crius marveled at his opponent's stupidity while also taking great care to avoid it. Chapter 494. However, the enemy he faced was ultimately not just one. Avoiding the one in front, there was another waiting for him, accompanied by yet another flash of light, amidst the spiritual interference. A beam of light released by the left head of the 3-headed demon god struck directly at Crius's left waist. The power of corrosion spread instantly, melting a large hole where it touched. If it weren't for his decisive action in cutting away the divine flesh and blood that was hit, the corrosion might have continued to spread across his divine body. This was yet another experience gained from being struck repeatedly. Instead of countering the corrosion with divine power, it was better to cut losses to preserve more important things. Huff! Furrowing his brow and taking a deep breath, the injury at his waist showed no signs of healing. Crius knew he was nearing his limit. Too much time had passed. Even with limited wisdom, the abyssal demon lords had gradually figured out his patterns, increasing the frequency of his injuries. Glancing again at the surrounding environment, that silver humanity who had been quiet since the battle began was still nowhere to be found. Crius gritted his teeth slightly. Indeed, these humans were unreliable. His expression changed. Suddenly, Crius, a lord of hell himself, seemed to have discovered something. A mix of surprise and dissatisfaction flashed across his face. The boy full of lies finally made a move. It was his aura, and when it came, it was with an uproar that even he found daunting. So he had gone to prepare his ultimate move. Feeling the alarm and dread rising in his heart, Crius grudgingly acknowledged this action. It was understandable. Compared to using the other party's feeble strength to fight the demon gods, preparing some other force was more appropriate. What puzzled him was, why had no one told him this beforehand? Forget it. In any case, it's finally your turn. Suspicions and questions were temporarily suppressed, to be investigated after the battle was over. Crius, watching the also agitated demon gods, couldn't help but reveal a thrilled smile. These twisted lives, I can finally... buzz. The thought had not even finished crossing his mind when in an instant, starting from the edge of the second layer of hell, a tremendously terrifying aura spread out. Within and beyond the realm, nearly all living beings felt that strong presence. Meanwhile, at the core of the central court, what had once been a large pit created when the god of sleep fell had now become a lake, with a small island in the center where a tall divine tree swayed gracefully. As the aura from the second layer of hell rose, this land seemingly unaffected by war also changed. A radiant light bloomed from the branches of the divine tree Nidhogg, which, upon closer inspection, bore a resemblance to the force that had once carried the god of sleep across heaven and earth. In an instant, two forces from different realms resonated together, intertwining yet remaining distinctly separate. When it all ended, like the tip and tail of an arrow, it pointed directly along a straight line at the demon gods still embroiled in fierce battle. What seemed like an age actually occurred in the blink of an eye. When the intense killing intent locked on its target, Crius hadn't even finished his thought. He should have been pleased, as this force was certainly not something the current demon gods could withstand, if he hadn't been within the range being targeted as well. With wide eyes and a fleeting look of astonishment, Crius seemed about to say something, but as the preparation completed, the enormous divine arrow had already been shot forth. In its path, space-time seemed frozen, the future upended. The divine arrow piercing through the world targeted the central head of the three-headed demon god, which, as if foreseeing its own demise, roared and broke free from the lock of space-time in an instant. Roar! That wasn't its own power but the protection inherited from Tartarus within the demon gods, a force not even Moya possessed. Even without personhood, the instinct of the abyss could still sense the difference between the mother of demons and her offspring. After all, as a former Titan deity she was immortal but they were not. So this force came into being. As first-generation demon gods conceived by Tartarus himself, sparing no cost from his origin, each was extraordinary. This was not only in terms of power but also because they contained a part of the abyssal origin and symbolized certain aspects of it, being part of his rules. Even if this symbolism was different from the power of the greater ones and only meaningful within the abyss, this further emphasized their importance to Tartarus himself. Therefore, the abyssal instinct did not wish for them to die, just as the present world did not wish for the deities to die. It generously bestowed power that would bring them back into the abyss when their lives were threatened by a higher force. If it had just been the power of the serpent of the central court, the bestowed protection would have taken effect. But reality held no ifs, and under this long premeditated arrow, All things were reduced to nothingness. It felt like days or scarcely a second. The concept of time had already blurred. In the moment perceived by outsiders, it was eternity in the eyes of Cryas. At the edge of his vision, he saw only a divine tree shaking, some terrifying thing approaching, and then all existence was erased, bit by bit, until it was his turn at last. Chapter 495. However, in the final second before his consciousness fully cleared, the former god of meteorology still took note of the fate of his adversary. The result, however, made him curse out loud. So, I'm the only one who didn't even leave a corpse behind? As the thought crossed his mind, he then sunk into a cold slumber, all that was happening on the battlefield now irrelevant to him. But it could be imagined that Cryas's sleep would likely only last for a brief moment. Soon, he would awaken anew in the boisterous hollow tunnels, unharmed in essence, and perhaps, before long, he might even celebrate the victory of the Nine Hells. In the first layer of hell, near the gateway blasted open by the Mother of Demons. At some unknown time, the once tranquil teenage deity who sat here playing his flute had vanished without a trace, leaving only a handful of gray feathers drifting down in the empty mid-air, with only 2 slumbering demon gods remaining. Yet by their looks, Squinos had evidently left only just a moment ago. Otherwise, deprived of his sustaining power, they would have likely awakened by now. Above in the high sky, relentless storms continued to blow, and small movements began to stir upon the bodies of the 2 demon gods. The last few gray feathers became blurred, as if about to vanish into nothingness with just a gust of wind. However, in the next moment, everything came to a halt. Chuff! From the deeper layers of hell, a certain power swept upward, unstoppable in its onslaught. At its forefront, it seemed to carry a ferocious head, struggling and roaring. That was the last refuge of the abyss's power. But as it advanced, that familiar head reverted back to its original form at a rate visible to the naked eye, returning to its initial state. Nonetheless, this did not hinder the force from moving onward. Even after it shattered the abyss's protection left on the 4 demon gods and lost most of its energy, it appeared unstoppable. As if sensing mortal danger, 2 invisible forces simultaneously rose upon the demon gods. They seemed to try and stop this exceedingly overwhelming attack, but the incoming wave only paused briefly before effortlessly breaking through the power repelled by hell itself. In the following moment, the divine arrow shot across the sky, its current brushing past the 2 demon gods. Although they weren't directly in the path of this divine arrow, the result was only marginally better. The black shadows seemed to awaken for an instant, then were torn asunder in a fraction of a second, plummeting to the outside world along the arrow's trajectory. On the other hand, the demon god shrouded in blue mist held up somewhat better. It managed to struggle before 1/3 of its body was cleaved away, plummeting alongside it into the void beyond hell. In the blink of an eye, with the last 2 demon gods, one dead and one wounded, the arrow still showed no sign of stopping. It continued forward, flying out beyond hell under the watchful eyes of many. Yet, it seemed to have reached the end of its strength, and its final resting place was not too far off, merely flying to where the serpent of the central court and Moya's powers met, amidst those time-space bubbles constantly being tainted and reborn. Carrying the arrowhead with the demon god's origin, it fell freely, embedding itself in that void. Like an axe-splitting chaos, where it landed marked the beginning of creation. All is going well. In the void, indifferent to the sudden shock and rage of Moya, the ancient serpent nodded slightly. Then, in the next moment, the sacrifice rule embedded in the interface due to Zeus's prior influence emerged. The Titans with their 3 heads and 8 arms wielded 3 distinct powers. One that slowly corrupted everything, one that efficiently annihilated all spirits, and the last in the middle that could siphon the power of its foes from slaughter to strengthen oneself. C3 to 117. The divine tree that grew from Gungnir's main trunk inherited its most core capabilities. One supplanting another, gains matched with sacrifices. Lastly, there was the unique connection between the abyss and hell. They fell together into that time-space bubble, the space that for many years had been born and destroyed in the clashes between the ancient serpent and Moya's powers, or the collision of hell and the abyss. You should have another title. A transformation was underway. The will of the abyss seemed to be boiling over with rage. But the ancient serpent was relaxed because at this point, everything was unstoppable. So, looking at the birth within the time-space bubble, seemingly slow but actually swiftly taking shape, even vaguely belonging both to the abyss and hell, a deep voice came from the serpent's head. A fight to the death, the survivor as the king. From this day on, you shall be called Azura Field. Chapter 496. A whale falls, thousands of lives flourish. Azura, this is a typical fabricated term, which in Lane's fleeting memory before he arrived in this world, existed in the mythology of another Eastern civilization. Sometimes they were seen as deities, but sometimes not. However, they mostly lacked innate duties and powers and were innately warlike, with a strong desire for life. Placing such a term here couldn't be more fitting. Thus, when the ancient serpent spoke, it was as if the world bestowed a true name upon the newborn realm, and the emerging domain was branded with a name at its origin. It looks like everything's going smoothly. In the slowed space-time influenced by some power, Asmodeus's tired voice rose again. In the distance, Moya had already regained composure. She no longer toyed with the lane and beauty that fell into her hand like a cat with a mouse, but surged forth with her power towards the nascent little world. She could already feel the violent tremors of Tartarus's will, the impact of the fall of a demon god. She intended to salvage whatever little she could, but watching Moya's actions, the ancient serpent showed no intention of stopping her. Because the brief period of confrontation had confirmed something, the mother of demons, although suddenly wielding such great power, had equally significant limitations. And that would soon become apparent. Yes, everything's going smoothly, except for the brave Cryas whose divine body was destroyed. There were no additional losses. It looks like me. Asmodeus continued, and this time the ancient serpent did not respond. Because just like he said, his divine body probably wouldn't escape death either. Actually, to speak frankly, even as Lane's evil side, the serpent of the Central Court didn't simply have him impersonate himself to attract attention for some perverse pleasure. The fundamental reason was his irreplaceability. Both he and the serpent of the Central Court had ownership of hell, which made manipulating fate a bit easier on that level. His true body was now truly hell itself, and the external divine body wasn't that important, so he matched better in various aspects. Of course, the most important point was, since he wasn't able to exert much power anyway, he might as well serve a purpose here. After all, when all one's power was used to counter the pressure from the abyss, that divine body naturally became just a shell. Though some divine power still lingered, the Lord of the Nine Hells had no energy left to separate his consciousness for battle. Therefore, Asmodeus simply offered it up, though he probably couldn't return, but that wasn't much of an issue. The new realm has indeed been born, and as expected, it's as if the whole world is a vast ceremony. In each battle that takes place within it, the losers will be sacrificed to the victors. This is the effect of the sacrifice rules written into the abyss and hell, and is the manifestation of the authority represented by that abyssal demon lord. Without receiving a response, but the voice continued nonetheless. Because the new realm's rules seemed reasonable, there were some problems within them. It will suppress a part of the divine-level power. This is also a protection for its own structural stability. Therefore, non-divine lives may become the main contenders in the future. But are there any non-divine existences in the current abyss? There are. Asserted confidently, the ancient serpent glanced towards the place from where it had just launched an attack, which was also the exit of hell. There, some lingering light flowed continually, leftovers from the deaths of those demon gods. Some were intercepted, and would become part of the Nine Hells' power as war trophies, but many escaped. This was also the final function of Tartarus's power. If the lives of the demon gods couldn't be saved, then protecting their own wealth was the most crucial matter. At least there are now. Speaking again, the ancient serpent withdrew its gaze. The first contest between purgatory and the abyss had thus come to an end. Deceiver! A sharp voice burst forth from within, and at the moment the power in hell exploded, Moya instantly realized she had been deceived. Although up to now, she still couldn't see what was wrong with the being she had captured. The truth was now clear. It must be a fake. They had tricked her in some way, played her for a fool, and she had been so self-satisfied just a moment ago. Her eyes filled with red, blood roiled over her body. Moya looked toward that forming world, her rage driving her to rush violently towards it. She wanted to destroy this creation, which was almost a proof of her humiliation. Even at some cost, she wanted to strangle this fragile trinket in its cradle. However, contrary to Moya's expectations, no one came to stop her. She charged to the edges of the emptying space-time bubble and collided with the newborn world. Boom! The roar erupted, the intense trembling causing Moya to feel momentarily dizzy. She was surprised, as her power at that time shouldn't have been harmed by such a small realm's fledgling form. That was supposed to be impossible. But it didn't matter. After such a blow, it must have already... How can this be? Stunned and confused, in front of Moya, the little world's form hadn't suffered much damage. It had merely been knocked out of position and then stopped changing. Chapter 497. A whale falls. Thousands of lives flourish under Saru. Everything in front of her seemed to still be mocking the mother of demons for her powerlessness. As rage surged through her heart wave after wave. This time, Moya seemed to forget that there were still enemies around her. She fixated on the embryonic form of the world interface, striking it with her limbs. Thud! The dull sound echoed, but still no damage was done. However, unlike before, Moya understood the reason for all this. Her once unrivaled power was erased the moment it collided with the interface. Or more precisely, the power of the abyss temporarily bestowed upon her to destroy hell vanished into thin air. And this was not due to anything else but the ownership of this nascent world. This was not a domain that was independent and autonomous like hell or the abyss, but rather an existence akin to the 9 layers of purgatory or the multi-layered structures within the abyss. It was not born of itself, but constructed jointly by 2 opposing yet originating worlds. It did not belong entirely to either one, so the rules of both worlds were reflected here. The consequence of this was that it could also be seen as a part of the abyss. When the Divine King in the mortal world was destroying the world itself, he faced only a weakening of his power, but Moya was not the king of the abyss. Her seemingly mighty power only existed when facing hell. Even those newly born demon gods were actually not affected by her power. This was evident from the beginning. During the time when Moya first regained consciousness and attacked the other demon gods in a fit of terror and rage subconsciously, but as expected, they were actually not injured. This power did not belong to her, and was even less stable than the divine authority. She was merely a user, not an owner. Swoosh! For a moment, standing there dazed, Moya did not know what to do, but the world did not stop for her. The sound of movement came from the entrance to hell, and in an instant, streams of light burst forth from it. Those were the unintercepted essences of the demon gods, spilling out under the protection of the power of the abyss, falling down like raindrops. The giant serpent that had been guarding the door opened its mouth wide, and a terrifying suction came from within. Stop! Boom! Defeat was now inevitable. Moya already felt the disappointment of the abyss towards her. One could imagine that when the first collision between the 2 worlds ended, the temporarily bestowed power upon her would never return. Perhaps by that time, Tartarus would choose the true king of the abyss in a way unique to him, or perhaps a prince with less ruling power, but all of that would be irrelevant to Moya. So she tried to reclaim something for herself in this last moment, even though it might not be very useful. Thus another battle erupted right there, but everyone knew it wouldn't last long. It was just the final aftershock of this conflict. Lava 303-7, near a volcanic crater. The god of sun, Helios, stood there, gazing at where the images used to be illuminated by the fire. With the death of the Shadow Flame Demon, that mysterious connection was also severed. But that arrow that shot through the sky, even viewed through the images, was still etched in Helios's heart. Of course, the arrow had always been a metaphor. In reality, it had nothing to do with actual arrows or similarity. Nevertheless, the power encapsulated within it was undeniably real. There actually exist forces within the abyss that oppose him. Crius has joined them. Is this really still the chaos world that I know? For a long time, the god of sun whispered silently, then turned and left without hesitation. This place was too terrifying. If it were only a few demon gods, he might not be able to defeat them but could still run. After all, they didn't seem very smart. He had been wary of Crius only because he couldn't outrun him and might have been trapped in the abyss. But facing that life or object which had released such terrifying power, he probably wouldn't even have the chance to run. Leaving layer 303 to 7 of the abyss, Helios flew swiftly in the direction from which he had come. Previously, one couldn't discern directions in the abyss, and now, he still couldn't distinguish up from down, left from right, but the layers of interfaces in the void themselves were the best landmarks. However, shortly after the god of sun had started to move, he suddenly looked back. There, countless streaks of light were falling like raindrops. That is, the specks of light were fast because they seemed to be affected by the power of the abyss. Helios dared not touch them, so he just watched as the colorful points of light whizzed past him and then disappeared into the distant void. There were a few exceptions, seemingly attracted by something. They fell directly into the layer that Helios had just left. And just as they entered, they underwent various changes. The power on the surface of the light points faded, revealing what was inside, remnants of demon gods. There were broken phosphorus armors burning with flames, eyeballs torn from wings, and chunks of flesh that were still wriggling incessantly. Then, right before Helios's eyes, as they touched the ground in a mere instant, they burst forth with unprecedented life force, transforming into a variety of different beings. There were eyeballs floating in midair, emitting a strong mental aura with nerves and tendrils drifting around. There were ferocious demons that burned with flames, looking extremely similar to the now-destroyed flame demon, and there were shadows writhing on the ground, their gathering and scattering influencing the surrounding environment. A whale falls, life teems. Although such a phrase did not exist in the chaos world, a similar notion nevertheless arose in Helios's heart. The current gods were immortal, so he had never seen the sight of a deity-level existence dying. But now it seemed their downfall was just a beginning, and from the corpses of those ancient beings, a brand new race would be born. They would become masters of the abyss in the future, this dead and empty world brimming with new life. Hiss! His expression subtly changing, Helios turned sharply. In the distance, in the place he had marked as layer 303 to 6, a massive worm was hissing at him through the barrier of the interface. And the moment he saw it, a name resembling the true names of real deities echoed from the depths of the god of sun's heart. Earth-shaking worm, a new god born after the demon god's limbs absorbed a portion of the abyss's power. In comparison to the already fallen progenitor, it no longer controlled life and transformation, and its power had only just reached the true god threshold. However, an intuition told Helios that although the power of this second-generation abyss deity may have greatly reduced at the start, they seemed to no longer be as irrational as the first generation. At least from the eyes of this newly born being before him, the god of sun felt as if he saw apprehension and threat. This was something the demon gods in the previous images did not possess. To them, there seemed to be only destruction and slaughter. Heh! This is just too outrageous. Am I witnessing an era transition that belongs to a world beyond? Although the power of the life before him posed no threat to him, thinking about the vast number of abyss's layers that he had passed through, a chill surged from the heart of the god of sun. He hoped they would stay in the abyss forever, never to come out. With that thought, Helios lingered no longer. He immediately transformed into a beam of golden light and fled back the way he came. This place was simply not suitable for his existence. Chapter 498. The Last Snow and Sound. Mortal Realm. Heavy snow envelopes the sky. In February, the ground remained covered with frost. The rotation of the 12 zodiac star domains had just reached the center of the 12th zodiac plane, and if it were in the distant future, it might have another more pleasant name, Pisces. Of course, whether it would still receive the same name in this lifetime was difficult to guess. At least for now, it was merely an ordinary star domain. The cold wind howled as always, and it was said that extremes meet, a truth universally acknowledged. But often, only true sages can see through the mist to glimpse the so-called extreme. At this moment, there was undoubtedly no such existence in the mortal realm, for they could not penetrate the veil of the natural changes reflecting the struggle between the gods. Thus, bloodshed and strife intensified, many grudges were formed, and numerous cities were destroyed. The losers lost their lives or died quietly in the cold and hunger. The winners weren't happy either, because as long as the catastrophe continued, they had to keep on winning. Thus, resentment began to accumulate, and curses on the disaster started to spread. When facing a crisis, people always need an outlet for their emotions, and conveniently, they had a target to vent their frustrations. It was certainly not the goddess of agriculture. After all, in the eyes of humans, Demeter was the only deity willing to help them firsthand. In human history, there was already a pivotal existence who brought disaster to the mortal realm and ended an epoch of mankind. She was Pandora, an ominous woman. The meaning of her name was originally the woman gifted with all talents, but now it is more often understood as the root of all disasters. In the north of the continent, on a path outside a nameless valley, a few crows circled in the sky, emitting harsh cries. The leafless trees shivered in the wind as if about to collapse at any moment. With a soft hat on his head and a blood-stained wooden staff in hand, a young man walked ahead under the drifting snow, followed closely by a stunningly beautiful woman. The cold wind entering the valley created a unique echo, accompanying the slow steps of the two. They seemed to have traveled far, yet no hint of fatigue showed on their faces. "Are you still thinking about those people we encountered before?" The staff thudded into the ground. For Epimetheus, he didn't need it to ensure the path under the snow was smooth, but he used it as if he did. Along the way, he had grown accustomed to posing as a mortal, which saved him a lot of trouble. "I just don't understand why they looked at me with such eyes." Following behind, Pandora's somewhat pale face was as beautiful as ever. It was a pity that in the northern lands swept by the chill wind, no one could appreciate her charming demeanor. "I haven't done anything. This natural disaster is unrelated to me, but why?" Her voice grew quieter and nearly imperceptible as Pandora seemed to recall that day. When she saw her subordinates killed effortlessly by Epimetheus, the young guard captain did not show a hint of fear. He still charged at the being before him and was then pinned to the ground by the man's staff. But until the last moment of his life, he looked at Pandora with eyes full of hate. They called her witch, implying a woman with extraordinary power like demonic monsters who would bring disaster to humans. But Pandora was very clear that, aside from the blessings of the gods on her body which she could not activate on her own, she was just an ordinary human, even unable to defeat that exceptionally skilled young man. If someone like her could bring about this world-engulfing blizzard, it would indeed sound like a joke. Why deceive yourself? You know very well why. Although you were deliberately bestowed with abundant curiosity, it doesn't mean you're really that stupid. You are different from the gods. With a faint smile, Epimetheus didn't seem to be referring to anyone in particular. After all, if a god is foolish now, it is quite likely they have been and will always be. Few among them can learn from experience. No matter how much time passes, they seem to remain unchanged. But you are human. You were not born with godhood, and consequently are not swayed by it. You are also unlike other mortals who only have a few decades of life. Therefore, you don't need to adopt such a posture. The changes in you along this journey, I've seen them all. There was no response, but following behind the man, Pandora's expression calmed. Indeed, as he had just said, perhaps at the very beginning, when she first opened the magic jar, she did feel sorrow and despair about the hatred and misunderstanding of mankind, but not anymore. A simple reason. Lengthy time can smooth over everything. What is brief to the gods is already enough for her. Compared to the misunderstandings of humanity, What she truly dwells on is the fearless bravery of that captain who did not fear death. He possessed a courage that most gods and humans do not have, and then he died so easily before her eyes. Actually, compared to that, I am rather curious. Why did you reveal your name, for what reason? Unaware of what the woman behind him was thinking, Epimetheus casually asked. Chapter 499. The Last Snow and Sound _2. You should know, when the deeds of your appearance spread, when those human corpses are discovered, your reputation as bringer of disaster will be solidified. And then, those beliefs that swirl around you, yet cannot be absorbed by you, will only grow more and more, leaving you restless day and night. Not intentionally, Pandora said without answering, merely correcting. I just forgot for a moment about my reputation among humans. Well, a momentary lapse, then. Epimetheus nodded, neither confirming nor denying. The two continued forward. They walked for a good while in the narrow stretch at the mouth of the valley until the space in front of them started to widen considerably. Here was no snowstorm, and the white frost falling from the sky seemed to encounter an invisible barrier, still teeming with life just a step away. Epimetheus stopped here, took a look around, then gestured lightly with his hand. You stay here for now. All right. Nodding, Epimetheus continued walking inside. Behind him, Pandora, holding the magic jar that had accompanied her for many years, watched his figure recede into the distance. Crossing over a small stream, just a few steps wide, passing by a small patch of farmland-like area, a delicate wooden cabin soon appeared at the end of the line of sight. In front of the cabin, there was a stone table, several chairs, and a small flower garden enclosed by a wooden fence. Everything bore a pastoral charm, even the middle-aged man who was the only one sitting there. Compared to the figure in his memory, this one seemed much older, but his demeanor was more relaxed. Father, it seems you've been living well under Mother Earth's protection. Striding forward, Epimetheus addressed the identity of the man before him. Iapetus, one of the least prominent among the Titan deities. His most lasting impression on the world is probably the fathering of the brothers Prometheus and others. Of course, all his children now could be considered enemies of the Olympian pantheon. There's no good or bad, just finding a place to live quietly. I want very little, so it's easy to be satisfied. Reclining and resting with his eyes closed on a rudimentary chair, Iapetus did not seem very enthusiastic about his long-lost son. That's good, since Mother left too. I've always thought you might feel lonely. Laughing, Epimetheus casually chose a chair and sat down. Around this valley, I've seen some rather special human tribes. They worship deities with the flesh and blood of wild beasts. Gods I've never heard of, and they proclaim all things have spirits. It seems they believe they are worshipping a tree, a rock, or some powerful wild beast or the like. I didn't really care about this until I found out those things actually possess consciousness and can absorb faith. Do you know what's going on? He asked casually, doubting he would get any answer. Even though this was happening not too far from here, he was sure his old father wouldn't take any interest, or more precisely, like him, to cautiously steer clear of such unexplained phenomena, particularly when one can't exert much power in the mortal realm. I don't know, as expected, Iapetus responded. If you're interested in them, you could stay around a little longer. And so, the topic ended there, as Epimetheus clearly had no wish to seek additional troubles for himself. But with the conversation begun, the long-estranged father and son started to talk about things both consequential and irrelevant. They talked about the old days, about Atlas who was still upholding the sky, and about Prometheus who had been sent to the East Sea. Mostly it was Epimetheus who spoke, while Iapetus occasionally reacted. It wasn't until the sun began to set that the afterthinker unintentionally asked a question. I recall, you once made a prophecy, seeing the vision of the sun falling into the East Sea. That wasn't my prophecy? Iapetus said softly, shaking his head. Destiny sought me out on its own. Whatever it is, Father, I'm just curious. In your understanding, how exactly does fate take effect? Or rather, can someone who holds fate truly control it at will? Looking up slightly, Iapetus turned his gaze to his son. Just like the past, the Afterthinker still didn't possess any of his brother's confidence and intelligence. Even now, he still felt the same. Probably not, that's my answer, Hyperion said calmly after a while, without giving a reason. I understand. With a smile still on his face, Epimetheus continued his conversation with his father until the sun had completely set. Then he spoke up to say goodbye. The moon had not yet risen when he started walking back to the mouth of the valley where Pandora was still waiting for him. Crossing the boundary between the warmth and the cold wind, the Afterthinker looked in the direction of the sunset. Now it was not Helios who sat on the golden chariot, but Apollo, who needed to exert all his strength to drive the divine chariot. One would think that compared to that peeping Tom who inherited Hyperion's title of High Perceiver, this temporary occupant, Apollo, probably didn't have the leisure to peer around indiscreetly. Let's go. With a call, Epimetheus walked back the way he came. Let's go to the mortal realm and then establish a church. Is that for you? Aren't we still considered criminals by Olympus? Of course it's not to establish it openly. Use your brain a bit. Shaking his head, Epimetheus said, Moreover, it's not a church for me. It's for you, of course, and your jar. Whoosh! Underworld, the entrance to the abyss. Space rippled, followed immediately by a flash of golden light. In the next moment, Helios appeared there, somewhat disheveled. However, there were no injuries on his body. Clearly, although he had just encountered a minor trouble, it was not enough to actually harm him. Phew! It seems my guess was right. Dozens, even hundreds. I wonder if this continues, will there be more gods in the abyss than there are outside? Is this really reasonable? He murmured with a long sigh, approaching the exit where Helios encountered a life form that had just been born from the corpse of a demon god. Unlike the earth-shaking worm he had met before, he did not witness the birth process of this entity. Therefore he could not learn its title, similar to a divine true name. Helios only saw a colossal silhouette that appeared silently behind the barrier of what he had marked as the third layer of the abyss. A spherical body floated in the air with a gigantic, single eye at the very front and center of its head and body, beneath which was a large mouth full of dagger-like teeth. Yet, the most eye-catching feature was the 10 tentacles writhing on the sphere, each ending with a small eye, all of which were fixedly staring at him. Then he experienced the feeling of being killed with a glance, as a beam of dissociating light emitted from the pupil of that eye, striking him directly, a complete outsider to the abyss. In the future, there won't be a future. I'm definitely not coming back to this damned place. Back in the real world, Helios finally felt somewhat safer. He couldn't help but relax, but soon after started to worry again. So where would Mother Earth be? Surely not asleep again? If that were really the case, then the god of sun had no recourse. The slumber of a primordial god is difficult to disturb by external forces. At least he didn't have the power to do so. What is it that you want from me? Of course. He turned around abruptly, but Helios saw nothing. He didn't think it was an illusion. Someone had definitely spoken to him just now. Honorable Mother Earth, may I ask? It is I. The voice came again, and in the next moment, a ruddy light appeared before Helios. It then expanded and morphed into a vortex. No matter what you seek me for, come here first. And what you encountered in the abyss, I would like to know as well, said the undeniable voice. Listening to it, Helios should have been happy. He hadn't found Gaia, but Gaia had taken the initiative to seek him out. Yet, for some reason, he now felt an inexplicable tension. Looking at the slowly rotating vortex, it seemed like another abyss to him. Chapter 500. Corona. Hesitation was but a momentary flicker before being dismissed from Helios's mind. Although the intuition of the primordial deities was indeed sharp, it was not surprising to the god of sun that he would have such a feeling. He was now, after all, somewhat of a member of the Olympian pantheon, and Gaia's conflict with Zeus was well known. Strictly speaking, they were still enemies, and perhaps that was the source of the warning. Pushing aside the unease in his heart, Helios stepped into the reddish-brown circle of light. With a flash, he vanished from the spot. Following a sensation of spatial transition, darkness fell before his eyes. Then light returned, and Helios found himself in a massive underground cavern. The ground was somewhat wet and slippery, uncomfortable to stand upon. Although his exact location remained unknown, the subtle shifts in the environmental laws allowed Helios to ascertain that he was no longer in the underworld. He must have returned to the surface or someplace near it. However, to his surprise, he could not recall Gaia ever wielding divine authority over the realm of space. Aside from the previous divine king, Cronus, no known deity had ever wielded such power. Therefore, even the divine arts created by the gods lacked similar capabilities. Regardless, she is a primordial deity, and even if she has lost face before Zeus, she must still possess some hidden methods. As the thought flickered through his mind, Helios's gaze shifted toward the center of the cavern. There, Mother Earth stood with her back to him. The brown dress was dotted with a few red spots, and the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes were clearly visible. Yet, contrary to the Gaia he had seen outside Mount Olympus, the one before him seemed in a markedly better condition. At least the skin that was exposed seemed to have more luster, and even her hair was no longer so dry and yellow. If this was not an intentionally feigned appearance by Mother Earth, then her power must have greatly recovered. Greetings to you, respected Mother of all gods. With a mind slightly abuzz, the unexpected scene before him made Helios somewhat worried. His previous thoughts were based on Gaia's deep hatred for Zeus, but his own power was vastly insufficient. However, thoughts aside, the god of sun did not stop his movements. He took a few steps forward and then gave a bow hand to chest. You seem to be in better health, which is indeed cause for celebration. Greetings. This does not seem like something an Olympian deity would do for me. As she turned slightly, looking at the god of sun before her, Gaia's voice was devoid of warmth. Yet I have never considered myself an Olympian deity. I long for the era of the Titans more than the present. Everyone knows the new divine court is composed of Zeus's family, and I am decidedly not one of them. Without pretense, Helios bluntly expressed his thoughts, believing that Mother Earth could see this for herself. And indeed it was so. Gaia had called the god of sun here not only out of interest in his experience in the abyss but also because he was seeking her out, and it seemed not at Zeus's behest. Coming to her, an enemy of Olympus, on his own, even with Gaia's wisdom she could guess that he might not be so obedient. What did you encounter in the abyss? Without immediately bringing up the divine king, Gaia instead mentioned the existence of Tartarus. Even though she no longer needed it, she still harbored resentment over Tartarus's earlier refusal. Something had undoubtedly occurred within her irrational brother, and the disheveled state of Helios upon his departure was the best evidence of that. The story is a long one. As unbelievable as it may sound, I actually encountered native life forms of the abyss. With a shimmering gaze, Helios spoke truthfully. They were numerous and hostile towards outsiders. I did not wish to conflict with them, so I retreated immediately. Life! She echoed the word, as if Gaia was beginning to understand Tartarus's reaction. If it had acquired life through some unknown means to her, it truly no longer needed her, and the refusal to admit her was not surprising. Perhaps it saw Gaia as a threat, and that's why she was barred from entry. However, since there was a person familiar with the details present before her, Mother Earth commanded without courtesy. Be more specific. What exactly did you see in there, and did you encounter Cryas? As you wish, I will tell the truth. With a slight nod, Helios immediately began recounting his observations. The numerous layers, the peculiar life forms existing within those planes, and the various phenomena that differed significantly from the outer world. Everything he described did not seem like the abyss but rather another material plane. Of course, in the end, Helios regretfully stated that he had not encountered the god of meteorology. After all, the abyss was too vast, and it was very difficult to find any particular deity without guidance. Moreover, his visit was not for the purpose of seeking Cryas. Gaia did not doubt his word, It was just a casual inquiry. Now her conflict with Zeus was not so much about Crius nor the golden apple tree, whose mastermind might be someone else. Compared to them, Zeus himself was the existence she could least tolerate. Chapter 501. Corona through. He established the authority of the divine king with his own dignity, so as long as he remained the sovereign of the gods, Gaia would never rest easy. Therefore, at the end of Helios's narrative, Gaia looked at this child of Hyperion. Compared to his father, Helios lacked that sense of ferocity and intensity, like a stone whose edges had been worn smooth, something anyone could hold in their hands. But now he had taken the initiative to seek her out. Perhaps this proved he had his own agenda? However, before that, Gaia needed to understand what grievance he had with Zeus that made him want to rebel against the other, even after witnessing the power of the divine king. He could not possibly have noticed the changes in himself recently. After all, even Gaia herself was surprised by it. So in the eyes of Helios, he was inferior to Zeus. With doubts in her heart, Gaia then asked, and in front of her, the god of sun gave an answer that left no room for questioning. Because the one driving the sun chariot now is not me, Mother Earth. This is the first time it has happened, and I hope it is also the last. I see. You are about to be replaced by Zeus's son, which is why you have come seeking my help. Previously not realizing it until reminded by him, Gaia suddenly became aware that although Helios was in front of her, the movement of the sun was still proceeding as usual. For a deity, the encroachment of authority is the most unbearable. It was not surprising that he would make such a choice, but in front of Helios, Gaia just sneered coldly. Light often accompanies the sun, so, in this sense, it is indeed possible you could be replaced by Zeus's son, but you may have found the wrong person. I am not a match for Zeus. Naturally, I cannot help you, and even if you want my assistance, what do you have that could move me? He faltered for a moment, but then Helios immediately said, I can work for you after all. You must have some matters that are inconvenient for you to handle yourself. Given your current relationship with Olympus, it would be quite difficult to find other help. Just like the goddess of the nether moon who resides in the underworld and the goddess of life who joined Olympus, they are the respective intermediaries of the other two primordial deities in this world, and I can become yours. I do not need a subordinate who has betrayed his father and two rulers, and although there is no possibility of reconciliation with Olympus, I do not need such an envoy with ulterior motives. Gaia interrupted coldly, rejecting him once again without mercy. She meant every word, and in front of her, Helios tried several times to say something in his defense, but in the end, he didn't voice it. He knew himself that his 3 acts of betrayal each had their reasons. Hyperion had locked him in the sun, fearing the child would contest with him for the dominion of the daylight. Cronus, although later didn't do much to him, had initially forced Helios to agree to the creation of the sun chariot to prevent another ruler of the stars from being born. As for Zeus, he now directly threatened Helios's authority. But the god of sun knew that even if he explained, Gaia was unlikely to listen to him. Because, as Mother Earth had said, the most crucial issue was, he was of no use to Gaia. Helios had thought that perhaps out of spite for Zeus, this capricious Mother Earth would agree to help him. But now it was clear things were different from what he had expected. With a heavy heart, but forcing a smile, the god of sun bid Gaia farewell. If that's the case, then respected Mother Earth, please allow me to take my leave. Turning back toward the way he had come, Helios's mind was already considering other options. No matter what, he couldn't just sit and wait. Yet as one foot had already crossed over the russet ring of light, at that moment, Mother Earth's voice once again came from behind him. Wait. Turning around in confusion, Helios did not know what else Gaia wanted to say. And facing the puzzled gaze of the god of sun, Gaia spoke indifferently. I will not help you, Helios, but perhaps you can help yourself. I now have my own matters to attend to and have no time to bother with the affairs on the surface. Zeus will pay for his arrogance, but not today. However, if you possess the power that Zeus fears, then his son will not be a threat to your position. But I do not have such power. He spoke slowly, Yet as he listened to Gaia's words, a sense of anticipation began to rise in Helios's heart. Mother Earth would not make such a statement without reason, and since she had mentioned it, "You can have it." Without disappointing Helios, Gaia merely smiled. The next moment, she lifted the veil of a concealing power. In an instant, everything before the god of sun transformed. He was no longer in a cave, but in a chamber of flesh and blood. The wet and slippery ground beneath his feet was not made of stone, but an egg teeming with life. Through the translucent membranes, Helios could see an entity with 100 heads swimming within, everything seeming so bizarre. But after his journey to the abyss, his acceptance of such matters had already advanced more than just one level. Among all these changes, only Gaia herself remained unchanged. She was still wearing her brown dress. Only the red spots had turned into crystal-clear branches that penetrated deep within. They glowed faintly, pulsing like blood vessels, as if they constantly transported something into Mother Earth's body. With each penetration, Gaia's presence became imperceptibly more profound. You don't have it now, but you can, if you are willing to accept it. In front of the god of sun, Gaia snapped off a piece of branch that resembled red crystal and tossed it towards Helios. Even after leaving her body, the branch seemed to retain its vitality. Fine tendrils were dropping from it, swaying in the air, as if searching for something. This is poison to mortals, but to a deity, it is merely a supplement. She wasn't lying, Gaia indeed thought so. That power from the outer god indeed possessed strong corruptive and erosive qualities, and it even influenced the spirit of its possessor. But under the protection of the current world's laws, it had not affected Gaia's sanity in the slightest. After all, she was the foundation of the current world, the original primordial deity. As long as nothing went wrong with the world itself, she would remain unaffected, or so she assumed for Helios as well. Implant it into your body, use yourself as a medium, and let its power strengthen the sun. Hyperion is the original sun, but you are not, for the sun and he were born together, whereas you were born from the sun. But if you can endow the sun with a new concept, maybe then you could attain the same authority as him. By that time, no one will be able to replace you. After a moment of silence, Helios's expression underwent some changes. What will I have to give up? If I allow this thing to take root in my divine body, I fear I'll never be able to rid myself of it. Indeed, but your promise had no guarantees to begin with. For the first time, Gaia felt quite good about commanding someone else rather than being commanded, so she elaborated a bit more. I only ask you to do one thing. On the day when my offspring ascend Olympus, you must join him, making Zeus pay the price. And on that day, perhaps when he has lost his throne, you too can try to become the divine king, just like your father once aspired to do. In Gaia's mind, she was now the partner of the flesh mother tree, and the other's wisdom was clearly not high, even restrained, so everything of them in this world was naturally to be managed by her. Having had enough of the reign of 3 generations of divine kings, if she could birth a divine king under her control, that wouldn't be too bad. Chapter 502 Ice Crown and Broken Steel. In the heart of the land of Chaos World, within a cavern filled with a blood-red hue, a discreet exchange swiftly came to an end. Everything remained concealed beneath the earth, with not even a trace on the path of fate. For although Gaia herself did not possess the power to obscure them, it didn't mean the mother tree was incapable of doing so. Or more precisely, the flesh mother tree didn't rely on any force or authority to hide this change. It simply existed there, and everything was veiled. The giant tree, now endowed with the traits of creation, was like a massive source of gravity, drawing all information and fate concerning itself to its vicinity, ensuring no accidents occurred until the moment Helios left. Everything proceeded as usual, with Helios continuing the task given by the divine king to mediate the conflict between Hades and the goddess of agriculture, and Gaia remaining there, using her unique status as a primordial god to pry open the blockade on the misty realm of Niflheim, ceaselessly drawing power. Accordingly, the mother tree from which power was being extracted was suitably generous. Whether it was Gaia's continually developing embryo or the newly joined sun, It did not refuse any who sought from it. Thus, from that day forth, the surface of the sun was graced with a faint red halo, adding a layer of splendor to the corona that made it look far more magnificent. Although this was quite an evident change, it went largely unnoticed. After all, the changes in the Chaos world had never ceased since the integration of the Nine Realms centuries ago, so even Zeus and Asgard did not react to it. Everything felt so natural. Only in the beginning did Apollo, who drove the sun chariot, notice that something was amiss, as he found the sun more difficult to control. Apollo had already started to struggle not long after Helios left, which was around the time he entered the abyss. Each day, dragging the colossal celestial body from the east to the west exhausted all his strength, and over time, it grew more unruly. However, Apollo did not perceive anything wrong in this, for all seemed to stem from the sun's own defiance, not from the interference of any deities using their divine power. Until he returned the sun chariot to Helios, he could not detect any of the events unfolding behind the scenes. Of course, even if he had checked, he wouldn't have been able to discern anything anyway. After all, only the god of sun truly understood the sun. As long as Helios stated, "This is a spontaneous change in the sun," no one could prove otherwise. In any case, everything was progressing smoothly. By the end of February, within the mortal realm city of Eryxis, Helios conveyed Hades's intentions to Demeter, the current situation of Persephone, and the dissatisfaction of the Olympian gods with it. They all hoped to end this sooner and get the mortal realm back on track. So, after confirming that her daughter had truly accepted the power of the underworld, the enraged goddess of agriculture eventually came to terms with the situation. She had to face the reality that in the future, Persephone would spend half the year on the surface and the other half in the underworld, being both the queen of the underworld and a deity of Olympus. With all matters settled amicably, the farce-like catastrophe drew to a close. By mid-March, as the path of the sun was poised to shift from the 12th to the first sign of the zodiac, at last, a spring breeze swept from the west, bringing long-missed vitality to the land. The winter destined to be remembered by mortals finally approached its end. In the southern part of the continent, atop an unnamed mountain peak, a golden scepter was held by a not-so-large palm, with delicate patterns swirling over every corner of its body. They glowed, twinkled, and resonated with a certain rule of the world. If one looked closely, they would discern that these intricate patterns were more than they seemed. They were a collection of scrolls, depicting the growth and ripening of every type of vegetation, and at the very top a conspicuous sheaf of wheat was entwined. This was not an innate feature of the divine artifact but rather a manifestation of culture and godhood born from sentient life. Unlike innate or objectively existing matter, these cultural divine roles, reliant on the birth of intelligent life, did not directly bestow divine power to their wielder, but they did effectively broaden the scope of their authority. At this moment, however, the brightly shining divine artifact was not unleashing any power but rather retracting its influence on the world. Under the control of its current wielder, the forces once released were recalled one by one, erasing the invisible shackles. All life resumed its growth. Then the cold weather stopped their budding. So, the next instant, within the all-spirit realm, the god of spring and renewal, prepared in advance, scattered her power to the world, allowing the spring wind to begin caressing the earth, and the complete cycle of the 4 seasons embarked on its first revolution. The calendar, established long before ancient times, was further perfected, tightly linked to the trajectory of the sun and the arrangement of the stars, granting even greater order to the world. The Chaos world took another step forward, but the script lost yet another page. Meanwhile, standing on the mountain peak, Eros looked at his twin brother. Chapter 503 Ice Crown and Broken Steel _2. The moment he set down the scepter, a blue ice crown settled upon Volos's head. The ice and snow on the ground, still not dissolved, seemed to resonate with him, congratulating their master on his birth. It seems you do not intend to directly integrate it into your body. After waiting a little while longer, until the ice crown had fully stabilized, Eros couldn't help but speak. Due to their special identities, the formation of the ice crown encountered no difficulties, which was precisely why the task was left to the two of them. And indeed, the result turned out just as expected. There is no need. Integrating it would only contaminate my pure origin. The separate seasons themselves are not a formidable godhood. If not for their cycle itself, I would hardly take any interest in it. Volos slowly opened his eyes and released his right hand. The scepter of wealth slipped from the palm, dropping straight to the ground, sinking into the soil, and then vanished without a trace. It likely returned to its master, but Volos did not feel any loss. The only use that the divine artifact had for him had already come to an end, and he did not plan to keep it in hand any longer. Let's go, it's time to return. Touching the top of his head, which was a bit uncomfortable, Volos still wasn't accustomed to suddenly having such a cold object. He intended to later leave it in the fourth layer of the spirit realm and let it participate in the cycle of the seasons by itself. As for the two of them, the recently born twins were still filled with curiosity about this world. They had already agreed to explore this world in their own way afterwards. Well, let's go back then. Nodding in agreement, Eros did not object. Before leaving, she glanced towards the northeast, where the city of Eryxis lay. 1,000 years later, or perhaps 2,000, she planned to go there and see what kind of legends the king, prince, queen, and goddess had left for the humans to come. Spirit Realm, 5th layer. The vast interface was as desolate as ever, and at the most central place, the opposing interfaces of positive and negative energy were still producing conflict and division. Since ending the expedition to the fantasy world some time ago, Lane had returned directly here, continuing to stabilize the cycles of these two inner realms. Although he was still indispensable here, as time passed, he needed to spend less and less effort on it. Therefore, in his free time, much like before, Lane naturally devoted his spare moments to other pursuits. Localization improvement of the rune scriptures was one aspect. He had even tried to complete a part of it, only to be unsatisfied and start over again. However, this time, due to the exploration of Zeus's memories, he gained 2 additional topics. The first goes without saying. Ever since obtaining the manifestation of the creation force, exploring its form of existence and understanding how to use it more skillfully became one of Lane's most pressing concerns. Yet this was even more difficult than improving the runes. Facing this nearly omnipotent force, he was like confronting the immortal nature of a deity. Although he could use it, he had not gained greater understanding of it. Therefore, after his attempts bore no fruit, Lane decisively set it aside for the time being. Perhaps, just as he needed to attain great divine power to carry the mighty symbol, only by reaching the realm of Tartarus or even the dawn of Gaia's birth could he truly understand the mysteries of the creation realm. By comparison, another topic seemed not so lofty. The ritual of Zeus, although profound, was something that Lane could deconstruct and comprehend. This method of constructing symbols through special means was like a primer, opening up Lane's thought processes considerably. If symbols could be constructed in such a way, then perhaps the more fundamental authority could be, too. However, the foundation that authority itself could become was a cornerstone for constructing symbols. Lane couldn't think of what could serve as the foundation of authority just yet. Faith was out of the question. It was too easily changed. There are exceptions, however, those faiths that are not born of worship and sacrifice. Those that have continuously arisen from the past of civilization are constant, he mumbled. But such power, it still doesn't seem quite suitable to be utilized by mortals. To touch upon faith before reaching the domain of a god might not be a good thing, he added. After some thought, Lane finally shook his head. If there ever came a day when he would venture to try himself, he would completely and thoroughly strip himself of his humanity, leaving no connection between it and his essence, for any connection, however slight, would make it easier for others to detect the link between this special incarnation and himself, and would likely create vulnerabilities in his path to godhood. If he relied on his own traits as a deity to exempt some of the difficulties on the road to godhood, it meant that his understanding of that stage would remain blank. His desire to retrace the long steps to godhood was to fill all the blanks, to fully understand from the origin the foundation of his existence. Naturally, he wouldn't think of cutting corners before even starting. It's still quite difficult, but that's to be expected, he sighed. I hope to reach a conclusion before this epic ends. No, a conclusion must be reached before this epic can end, he resolved. With a calm expression, Lane lightly tapped his fingers, and a peculiar formation with 12 vertices appeared once again in front of him in the void. The ritual of Zeus was based on the position of the divine king. Mere imitation wouldn't be effective, so Lane had been trying to modify its form to make it seem more useful. Initially, he chose to modify the more complete part, the one perfected by the world law. However, Lane soon discovered that this version was too deeply integrated with the current world. Although it seemed stronger, many aspects were actually not conducive to his changes. Therefore, he quickly switched his target and took out the original version of the ritual used by the primeval Zeus. In this rougher version of the ritual, both the divine king and queen of gods were among the principal gods. But Lane noticed the differences because, in this version of the ritual, the actual principal god was Zeus of Thunder rather than King Zeus. This effectively avoided the problem of an imbalance in power among the 12 pillars of the primeval ritual. Of course, the problem still existed, but it was exempted to some extent. And the presence of the Queen of Gods was no longer special in this ritual. Hence, in the end, Lane simply gleaned a seemingly useless and strange ritual from it.
A ceiling technique.
He pondered. A core, 12 nodes, which can operate positively, allowing the nodes to supply power to the core, or negatively, extracting the core's power by the 12 nodes, turning it into a barrier sealing itself. But what do I need it for? He wondered. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly as Lane himself couldn't figure out where to apply this ritual. Fortunately, like this ritual whose purpose was still unknown, he had many others. For instance, there was the poison from Odin's vault, and also the shattered steel, which to this day, he had not managed to analyze for use. Chapter 504 Mark. Speaking of that steel, I almost forgot about it. Looking at the ceremonial patterns of no apparent use, Lane suddenly recalled the broken steel that he had tossed into the depths of his collection long ago. In Odin's treasury, he had successively acquired the Draupnir, the divine sword Levitian, the rune scriptures of the origin text, a poison and its antidote based on the poison springs of Niflheim, and the grudge of the primordial giant Ymir. Some of these items had been used, while others had not to this day, but anyway, Lane knew what they were for more or less. The only exception was that broken steel obtained at the same time, which, from the moment he acquired it, he never understood what it was for. Even under his scrutiny, it seemed nothing more than an utterly ordinary object. Lane had even tried to destroy it once but quickly stopped after only wearing away a corner. He realized that this steel was not, as he thought, some unfathomable divine object, with the property of indestructibility, despite its ordinariness. On the contrary, all its properties proved it to be nothing more than a stone, albeit possibly an old one. However, since it wasn't an object from Chaos World, Lane couldn't accurately judge the years it had endured. If this object hadn't appeared in Odin's treasury, collected along with other treasures by that otherworldly divine king, probably no deity would have given it a second glance. But there are no what-ifs, so even though he couldn't tell its purpose at that time, Lane still kept it well preserved. Actually, Lane took the otherworld divine king very seriously in his heart. His journey through the 9 realms made it clear that this world didn't seem to be as described in the Scandinavian mythology. Quite the contrary, there were significant differences. If Chaos World had embarked on a completely different destiny because of his presence, then the changes in the 9 realms were undoubtedly closely related to Odin, who had foreseen the end of all things. So much so that when Lane saw Odin's figure again in Athena's memories, he felt it was only natural. This one-eyed divine king, who rode the 8-legged horse Sleipnir, must have some secrets unknown to others, and perhaps the steel was related to them, or maybe not, but in any case it must be something valuable. But now, remembering it again, Lane realized he should probably retrieve it, because unlike before, he now had a new tool. I remember it being over there. With some memory effort, Lane found that steel in a secluded palace on Mount Sinai, where it had been placed and never again removed. Since he wasn't sure what was special about it, Lane couldn't be certain whether the laws of chaos would affect it. Thus, in that secluded palace, he artificially created an environment with rules similar to those of the 9 realms. So, with a wave of temporal fluctuation, the broken steel appeared before Lane. However, as with every time before, he couldn't see anything wrong with it. Not attempting anything futile, Lane lifted his hand, and a droplet materialized by the creation force fell directly into his palm. The temporal divinity that constituted the foundation of the spirit realm trembled slightly, as if resonating with this primal force. It was its presence that allowed the droplet to be used and not be utterly untouchable like it would be in two separate dimensions. However, Lane didn't plan to use it for anything right now. He was simply maintaining the contact and once again looked towards that utterly ordinary steel. The worn surface of the steel seemed to have once had some text, but it had long since become blurred and difficult to discern. Previous inspections often ended here. It didn't show any peculiarities. But this time, from a higher perspective, Lane felt he might actually have seen something. Is this a marker? It was a mark as incomplete as the steel itself or a coordinate sign or something else. There was no doubt it was something with directionality, and the location it pointed to was not presented as a coordinate in time and space. Lane found it hard to describe this way of presentation. Anyway, it was indeed a guide, and it seemed to exist in the same location as the stone, but the latter seemed to be just a carrier for the former. Indeed, it was just an utterly ordinary steel, becoming significant only because of this marker, for some reason falling upon it. So what is this marker for? Who left it, or is it naturally formed? And Odin, why did he have such an object? With eyes slightly narrowed, Lane felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity looking at this strange marker. It seemed he had had some connection with this thing, yet he had absolutely no recollection of it. Interesting, if it's a trace that only world-level power can detect, then how did Odin perceive it? Or perhaps he didn't see this marker at all, just like me before, knowing it's important but not why. Speculations flashed through his mind, then were swiftly dismissed. Perhaps when the Nine Realms still existed, this marker had not been as dormant as it is now. These guesses had no evidence after all. And since Odin was already dead, no one could know what he thought. So Lane stopped pondering, merely enduring the pressure that the contact with the droplet placed on him while he contemplated what he should do. Chapter 505 Mark_2. The fragmented marks left in the treasury of the Nine Realms hardly seemed to point towards any location within the Chaos world, though certainty was impossible. Perhaps it pointed to a place within one of the 9 great domains, now a part of Chaos. Regardless, it was a matter worth exploring, but recently, Lane had no time to roam about. He first had to wait here until the interface with the negative energy world fully stabilized and then, during Typhon's advent, find the location of the Heminu world. Before that, he did not intend to make any significant moves. Moreover, this mark was incomplete, and no one could guarantee it would lead to the correct place. So, observing the fragmented mark, Lane eventually only infused a trace of spirituality into it, then let it drift into the void under the protection of the space-time force, following the guide of the mark. He had no expectation that this force would have any effect. It was merely a tentative exploration. After this step, Lane disconnected from the drop and casually sent the steel back to the palace. This event was just a minor interlude, not requiring much attention until specific results emerged. However, speaking of which, I do wonder what Gaia is up to right now. Legends say that in her wrath, Mother Earth mated with Tartarus and gave birth to Typhon, the king of all monsters with 100 heads and serpents, in a cave in the Cheriki area. But from the current situation, it seems like the Abyss hasn't suddenly released any power to the outside world. Somewhat puzzled, the anticipated changes had not occurred even after the initial battles of Hell had ended, which was somewhat unexpected for Lane. He had thought that as soon as Gaia left Olympus in anger, her breeding with the Abyss would happen swiftly. It would occupy Tartarus's attention to some extent, and the force he and the god of sleep had sent to Hell early on would take effect. Yes, before Mephisto made his suggestion, Lane certainly had thought of some contingency plans. This was his prepared backup plan, and Lane had intended to rely on it to take out a demon god at a critical moment. However, with other options available, this attack naturally combined with the fully charged attack of the Serpent of the Central Court, nearly ending all the first-generation demons. Perhaps there is a misunderstanding in my interpretation of the myth. Maybe the content of the myth is merely symbolic, and the account of Gaia and Tartarus's breeding has another interpretation. And there's no rule saying Gaia has to immediately conceive offspring after leaving Olympus. In the timeline of myths, delaying for a few hundred years seems to be quite normal. Unable to fully understand, Lane eventually set the matter aside. The main body of current destiny remained unbreakable. Regardless, such an important part might deviate, but it would not deviate too drastically. Therefore, Typhon would not disappear without explanation. It was just a matter of sooner or later. As for the possibility that Gaia's mate might have been replaced by another great divine power, it was not entirely possible, but at least no signs were evident for now. Moreover, the birth order of the chaotic gods had been disrupted, so it would be irrational for Lane to be certain that Typhon must be born within a set time frame. Nevertheless, he still paid extra attention to the realm of lightness and the sealed Niflheim. Lane was also well aware that if Erebus, who held the secrets, truly wanted to do something, he might not detect it immediately, and if the Mother Tree truly had the ability to break through the seal that Chaos had placed on it, then the likelihood of him observing their traces was similarly slim. Great divine power was not like the gods of Olympus, who could notice the actions of others with just a glance. Even Gaia could shield herself from other scrutiny, only she could not conceal her existence as effectively as the others. Coming out of his contemplation, having finally settled a few matters at hand, Lane relaxed slightly. Looking at the dark hues of the fifth floor of the spirit realm, Lane softly called out, "Liana!" She, a loyal angel, had sought him out for a matter not related to the spirit realm, but concerning the Silver Moon City in the mortal realm. Since the end of the flood and the fulfillment of the covenant with Prometheus, Lane had paid little attention to the affairs of Silver Moon City. The city was entirely managed by a few interested angels, and even when accessing consciousness through the Tome of All Spells, he was more concerned with the development of witchcraft and the birth of various new knowledge. This time, however, was different because according to Liana, the mortal who had a fateful encounter with Lane during the Great Flood was finally approaching the end of his lifespan. He was one of the rare believers deemed faithful by the angels, and they had intended to grant him higher honors, but he refused eternal life in the mortal world, instead choosing to return to the embrace of the spirit realm. A problem then presented itself to the angels. Such a devout human, who also made contributions to the spread of the Lord's miracles, surely deserved a reward. But it seemed that, in the entire spirit realm, there had never been a mechanism for handling such devout believers in the past. The goddess of law established a divine kingdom in the fifth level of the spirit realm to accommodate the souls of her faithful followers after death, but Lane had never created a similar place. The golden humanity entered Seven Hills Paradise, the silver humanity went into 9 layers of hell. So where would the survivor of the Bronze Age end up? The angels did not make the decision lightly, and ultimately, it was brought before Lane. His judgment on this human would serve as a standard by which the fates of those faithful believers to come would be measured. Nuaw, that seems to be his name. Looking outward at the grandiose and magnificent city that hardly seemed a creation of its time, Lane noticed the residents gathered in front of the great temple. In their own way, they were bidding farewell to the prophet, who had led them for hundreds of years and witnessing his return to the Lord's kingdom. Mortal realm, southeast of the continent. Although the heavy snow had not yet abated, the temperature had started to rise. However, for the inhabitants dwelling in this semi-magical city, they barely felt the changes in the external climate. Having not experienced hunger or cold during the winter season, they naturally didn't hold great expectations for spring. Moreover, in this special city, spring never truly departed. But today was different. According to the announcement already made, the great prophet, who had lived for hundreds of years despite not carrying the bloodline of water elves, had finally reached the end of his years. The city was about to undergo a monumental change because no one knew what direction Silver Moon City would take after his death. Nuaw, praised as a saint by the Lord's messengers, was the only mortal who could directly communicate with the winged angels and the recognized ruler by all residents of Silver Moon City. But after his death, there was nobody who could find another with the same achievements or abilities to succeed him, which gave rise to much speculation among the people. Of course, all that was a matter for the past and the future. At least for now, most people were immersed in their sorrow. They gathered spontaneously in front of the temple, waiting for his return to the heavenly kingdom of the Lord. Chapter 506, The Prophet's Admonition. In the center of Silver Moon City, a bustling crowd gathered en masse. On both sides of the street, ever-burning magic lamps illuminated the night, revealing an endless stream of people to the eye. Nearly half of the city's residents had left their homes today to bid farewell to the last of the city founders from that year. After all, apart from Nuwa, those who had escaped the Great Flood with him had long since passed away. Among them, some had achieved minor feats on extraordinary paths, but there were no truly gifted individuals. Thus, under the weight of centuries, they too had naturally been laid to rest in the earth, living on only in people's memories. Following a tradition said to descend from the Golden Age, the residents of Silver Moon City erected a stele for each deceased, engraving upon it some tales from their lives. They were uniformly buried near Starfall Lake, where they built a temple dedicated to the three angels of death. This was how people commemorated the presence of their ancestors. After all, every person in Silver Moon City today descended from them, and today it was the turn of their very last member. An era was about to end, and from now on the city would turn a new page. Kanios, just an ordinary member of the city, glanced at the crowded throngs and couldn't help but smirk. Tens of thousands, perhaps even over 100,000 people. Forgive him for not understanding arithmetic, for in this age even the wizards scarcely did. Experience, tradition, and flashes of inspiration were the mainstay now, with calculation merely a supplementary tool. Besides, even if he understood, Kanios doubted he could gauge the exact number of people present with his eyes alone. This was the largest human city in the world, and although the people of Silver Moon City had not seen other cities, they all believed this to be true. Deo, I told you before, the city will be crowded today, even the main avenue. Even if we elbow our way through, it's impossible to see the great prophet. Kanios complained as he passed under the tall Silver Gate. Currently, there were 3 gateways piercing through the central avenue of Silver Moon City, each named by humans from 3 different eras, though, according to the original plan, there could be a total of 7 layers. The remaining 4 would memorialize significant events in the future, such as the 4th gateway now under construction, the Enoch Gate. In essence, it meant the gateway named after the great prophet Nuwa. At a time like this, those surrounding the great prophet are all significant figures. Deo, do you know what a significant figure is? It's those who can dictate the laws of Silver Moon City, or summon the wind and call the rain with their own power. Clearly, we are not like them. I know, but at least we can see the great prophet's remains being escorted out of the temple and sent to that graveyard. If we're even luckier, maybe we'll see the legendary angels. Ignoring Kanios' complaints, the girl known as Deo continued to forge ahead through the crowd. However, her slender frame could hardly push through, and so the young man had no choice but to follow and help. To him, it didn't really matter what kind of person someone was in life. After death, they were just a corpse. Spending a whole night just to see a dead body seemed incredibly boring. With that time, he'd rather practice his swordsmanship more, hoping to be recognized by the temple's priests as meeting the standard of will. At that moment, he could combine with the curse attribute and become a reserve temple guard. The temple's priests often said that only faith in God could fortify the will and remain unharmed against the mental onslaught of the curse attribute. However, Kanios knew it wasn't entirely true. Perhaps faith was indeed beneficial, but honing swordsmanship and the physique could also temper the spirit. Compared with the elusive piety, he favored things tangible and visible. Of course, that didn't mean he was faithless. There were hardly any non-believers among the residents of Silver Moon City, regardless of who they were. Deo, who do you think will assume the role of the next patriarch after the great prophet's death? This matter has dragged on for a long time now, and there should be a conclusion, Kanios said, protecting the girl who seemed somewhat attractive to him, pushing forward as he spoke casually. Compared to him, Deo was a model believer. She not only recited the scriptures fluently but also always paid attention to the significant figures who normally had nothing to do with them. Over time, she had made him familiar with plenty. This was unusual in Silver Moon City. In fact, even in human societies of later generations, the number of citizens who could call out more than 10 names and positions of their country's leaders was not in the majority, even more so in this classical age. "I know what you're thinking, Khanios," Deo said, glancing at the man in front of her while stroking her brown hair. She saw right through his thoughts, but she didn't think his plans would come to fruition. Lord Damien has always advocated for expansion, for Silver Moon City to claim vaster territories. If he becomes the next patriarch, he will certainly increase the quota for temple guard recruits. But taking shortcuts is meaningless. If you make it through the selection that way, even if you succeed, you will only be at the bottom. Chapter 507, The Prophet's Admonition _2. And to be honest, not many people support His Excellency's proposal, and you know why. Indeed, Khanios knew why, because this was Silver Moon City, a city protected by the magic net personally arranged by the deity. Here, it was spring all year round, with a natural bay serving as a fine harbor, and there was no lack of food and resources. It was the best place to live. In comparison, the residents of Silver Moon City had at least heard something about the outside world. It was said to be wild and dangerous, with vastly different climates. The former had not been seen by many, but the latter was still evident. Just by comparing the lingering snow outside with the warmth of the city, everyone knew what to choose. In such circumstances, the proposal of His Excellency Damien wasn't widely accepted. After all, the residents of Silver Moon City couldn't figure out why they would leave this divine gift of a city to face snowstorms and hardships. "Don't say that, Deo. I'm actually pretty confident about passing the test. It's just that no one dislikes a bit more security. And honestly, don't you think we have a bit too many people?" Khanios explained with a smile as he looked at the crowded throng around him. To the humans of this era, it was difficult to imagine a city with a population of over 1 million people. After all, historically, the cities with a large population during classical times were without exception the capitals of great empires or the core of vast territories. They relied on continuous water or land transport to support their operations, devouring resources from all directions day and night. Without these, their existence would have been difficult to sustain. But Silver Moon City didn't need all that. They had the existence of witchcraft. They didn't need other places to sustain them. With such a reckless display of transcendent power, no problem was a problem. Even with only one city, self-sufficiency was still possible. "But our population will continue to grow, Deo. Although I'm not one of those big shots and don't know exactly how many people there are in this city, it's definitely a number beyond my imagination. We will eventually fill this place and then have no choice but to venture out. Since there is bound to be such a day, why not plan for it sooner? Then since you are destined to eat 2 meals a day, why don't you cram all your day's food into 1 meal? Deo snorted lightly, jabbing a bit. In front of her, Khanios just smiled nonchalantly. They had had similar debates several times, but after all, both of them only had a glimpse of the whole picture. Although chaos had no such idiom, there was still a similar proverb. Neither of them knew how many people were in the city or what the wilderness was truly like. So Khanios had no intention of arguing with Deo over such trivial matters. The brief exchange ended and the two continued to weave through the dense crowd. Time slowly passed, and when the moon was directly above in the sky, they finally reached a place where they could barely see the doors of the temple. The cliff on which the temple was built was also crowded at this moment. But about 100 meters from the temple, there seemed to be an invisible line that separated the vast throng of people. Khanios didn't know whether it was some trick used by the big shots inside the temple or if people had stopped on their own accord, but he tended to lean toward the latter. None of the residents of Silver Moon City would dare act recklessly there, and those beings who could summon the winds and call the rain were unlikely to display their power at the temple's gates. "This is as far as I can go. Can't do anything more beyond this point." Khanios spread his hands helplessly, not being a powerful warrior. He didn't think he could make it any further. Seeing this, Deo nodded her head, clearly aware of his limitations. "Then let's stay here, Khanios. The Church's scripture says that all life will return to the Lord's kingdom after death and be judged based on their abilities in life. Although I don't know what judgment the great patriarch will receive, I suppose no one could surpass him. Swinging his fist, Deo gazed at the gates of the temple that stood shut. The term patriarch originally referred to an elder, a respectable person, and in some places even meant father. Thus, the Church of Silver Moon City used this title to describe the highest spokesperson of deity in the mortal realm, and it was one of the titles bestowed upon Nuwa. However, for most people they still preferred to call Nuwa the Great Prophet, because according to the Church's scripture, it was he who recognized the deity walking among humans and then, inspired by the divine, journeyed east to build a city in this starlit place. Even in some rumors, Nuwa had foreseen the Great Flood in his dreams, an account that, since it had been denied by Nuwa himself, was not recorded in the scripture, but Deo felt that one day this part would eventually be added to the newly revised texts. In any case, may you find peace in the Lord's kingdom, Deo whispered within his heart, his eyes slightly closed. By his side, many others closed their eyes too, praying for the blessing of this soon-to-depart Holy One. Cough, cough. Sit down, everyone. I don't care about these formalities. And there's no need for you to be so ceremonious in front of a dying man. In the vastness of the temple, just like many years before, Nuwa sat in his wheelchair. Although it was inside the temple, this place was not where the deity was worshipped. The complex that enveloped the entire cliff had long since ceased to look like it did hundreds of years ago. Other than the most central part of the temple, other buildings of various purposes had risen around it. Therefore, in this great hall usually used for meetings, the high-ranking officials of the church were gathered here. They looked at the man seated in the wheelchair with sad faces. Even though Nuwa's visage was the same as ever, everyone seated could sense the decay emanating from him. Although most of them were users of divine arts, their bodies had acquired certain transcendent qualities due to the constant bath in high concentrations of sacred power. No one would fail to recognize the sense that a life was nearing its end. There's no need to look at me like that, cough cough, every human inevitably dies, it's only a matter of sooner or later. I'm not here to see you sorrow for me. Let me take the time to arrange the last matters. Nuwa said with a cough, smiling as he looked around. A single generation's time was not enough for an organization to decay, especially in an era when the transcendent revealed their sanctity. Thus, he could proudly declare that everyone present was a devout believer, each endowed with exceptional abilities. Even if they had differing opinions, they were all striving only to make Silver Moon City's future better and spread the Lord's faith. However, a true sage always looks further ahead. Although Nuwa never considered himself a sage or a prophet, by learning from the past downfall of bronze humanity, he learned many lessons. Therefore, meeting the gazes of everyone present, he spoke his last words. I have much I want to say, but most importantly, from the beginning, the church shall not have an immortal patriarch. Stroking the armrest of his wheelchair, Nuwa's voice was steady and unhurried. Life belongs to the mortal realm, the soul to my Lord. Those unwilling to return to the embrace of the Lord should naturally not become his spokesperson on earth. Chapter 508 Archbishop. His face calm, Nuwa's voice echoed within the temple. Surrounding him, none of the senior members of the church showed any sign of questioning or opposition. This was not solely due to Nuwa's reputation and status, but also because those present did not see any issue with it. Long before now, Nuwa had illustrated similar views to them on more than one occasion, and now he had truly acted accordingly. Furthermore, even without considering these factors, the objective conditions for a simple and easy path to immortality did not exist at the moment. Nuwa was capable of achieving this because his devotion and meritorious service had received angelic approval. They were willing to grant him eternal life, but this did not mean that others would enjoy the same honor. As for the methods of witchcraft, it could indeed extend life to a certain extent, but eternity was still a distant proposition for it. The reasons were not complicated. Initially, witchcraft was compiled by Lane from a lofty perspective. Later, Hecate researched it bit by bit. These two beings, who were most likely to develop a method for immortality through witchcraft, had no plans to study the path of immortality, because they had no need for it. comparatively, humans' own level of witchcraft was clearly insufficient to conquer this difficult challenge. Perhaps it could be achieved in the future, but that was destined to be a distant future. For most people, if an event is something they will probably never witness, then they naturally will not strongly oppose it. Of course, aside from all these objective factors, there was a key point. As believers, the senior figures of the church did not see death as something to be feared. The cycle of samsara of all spirits was one of the authorities of the gods, and some had even seen Eunomia, who had come to the mortal realm, together with Nuwa. Under such circumstances, without the unknown, there naturally would be no fear. Very well, seated in his wheelchair, Nuwa nodded with a smile, not surprised by their reaction. It seems you all agree with my view on this matter. You are a prophet with divine revelation, teacher. Whatever your view is, we will all agree, said a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. Of course, she was actually over 100 years old, but the bloodline from the water elves in the residents of Silver Moon City greatly slowed down the aging process. Even though this speed varied from person to person, with only a very few enjoying a lifespan of 300 to 500 years or more, on average, they lived twice as long as their counterparts. No one is always right, Elma. I am just learning lessons from the past, Nuwa said with some helplessness, as he shook his head at his students' respect. In his heart, it was this very reverence from those around him that was one of the real reasons that prompted him to choose death. It had been too long since anyone in Silver Moon City had been willing to question him. It was as if everything he did was correct. But Nuwa himself didn't think so. Apart from the omniscient, no one was always right, and he believed that such excessive reverence could potentially evolve into something else. Prometheus was a clear example. While Nuwa himself highly respected the creator of bronze humanity, there were some actions of the other that he did not approve of. Now, let's move on to the arrangements after my death. Nuwa shook his head slightly. Perhaps because he was nearing the end of his life, his thoughts were somewhat scattered, but when he came back to his senses, he calmly proceeded to lay out all that had been decided beforehand. Silver Moon City will need a new patriarch. He will take my place, communicate with the Lord's messengers, and guide the future direction of Silver Moon City. That is the most important reason for having convened you here today. You want this position, as it brings you closer to the divine, and each of you has your differing views. Some of you want to maintain the status quo, while others believe that the actions of wizards should be restricted. Some want to reclaim the wilderness on land, and others have turned their ambitions to the seas. And it is not just a solitary view. Many around each of you agree, some acting for their own sake, others for the future of Silver Moon City. So you all await my decision, as whomever I choose will imply my endorsement of their ideas. And I have never passed judgment on your opinions before today. Yes, teacher? A middle-aged man who looked more warrior than priest said. We have argued many times in your presence and all voiced our viewpoints, but we have convinced none, as our wisdom is not sufficient to make a universally accepted decision. Only you can do that, so we await your verdict. No, Damien, I can't. The fact that you believe I am right doesn't mean my choices are indeed correct. The reason I have not made a decision is that I cannot make a definitive judgment either. Like you, if I tell you to give up your plans, would you truly be convinced? I will follow your command, for you must have seen a future that I have not yet seen. The man known as Damien spoke respectfully while standing in front of Nuwa. Nuwa shook his head slightly, knowing this would be the outcome. The long-standing debates among those present were known, and he was aware of why they were unresolved. It was not only because each of them stood firm on their views, but also because none had a clear edge in prestige or capability over the others. Chapter 509 Archbishop_2. Silver Moon City had been peaceful for far too long. They had no external enemies, no difficulties, no natural disasters. Under these circumstances, naturally, no one was able to achieve feats that would convince the vast majority. Therefore, by relying solely on themselves, they were, in any case, unable to reach a consensus. But just as Nuwa himself said, he didn't know who was right either. He never saw himself as a prophet, nor did he think he could see farther than everyone else. Thus, looking at the few individuals standing quietly before him, Nuwa finally made a decision. If conjecture could not produce a result, Then let reality verify the truth. Fortunately for Silver Moon City, which had been at peace for so many years, they had ample ability to support this. Your debates have led to no conclusion, and I do not intend to make a decision arbitrarily. However, I still support your differing opinions. Having disagreements is good, and the Lord favors change and differences even more. Therefore, my final decision is to abstain from appointing a patriarch for the time being. As his words fell, Nuwa clearly saw the surprised expressions on several people's faces, but no one outright objected, because they all sensed Nuwa still had more to say. Actions speak louder than words, and each of you has your own supporters. Given that, let each of you verify your ideas. Those who wish to explore beyond, I allow you to lead those willing to follow you to conquer the seas and wilderness. Those who choose to stay in Silver Moon City, you shall remain here, forming a council. Only decisions supported by the majority may be implemented. Once I am gone, there won't be such a mountain blocking you from testing your own thoughts anymore. After everything bears results, the one with the greatest achievements will become the next patriarch. You are not a mountain obstructing us. Bowing slightly, without being pleased that his own proposal had been partially implemented, Damien immediately corrected. And to this, Nuwa only smiled, knowing that the other had always lacked a sense of humor. Let it be so then. May ability decide the outcomes. I trust that none of you will hinder each other, and those who remain in Silver Moon City won't forbid those who leave from returning. Right? Of course, we are always one, someone said, and Nuwa nodded, believing their words. Very well, everything shall proceed accordingly. And since some among you seek to establish towns in the wilderness alone, it is perhaps not apt to continue calling you priests. Those advocating for the church's mission on one side shall be named archbishop, and according to the specific nature of the responsibilities, a prefix may be added before it. No one objected, so another matter was settled. However, after making the last decision, a trace of irrepressible weariness appeared on Nuwa's face. For someone so close to death, he truly had done too much. Holding power in Silver Moon City for so many years, Nuwa certainly had many affairs that needed addressing, but those had long been taken care of previously. Now, completely relaxed, Nuwa leaned back in his chair, gently closing his eyes. No one disturbed him. They just waited quietly, and after a long while, Nuwa, seemingly having regained some energy, opened his eyes again. Everyone, leave. Raising his hands slightly, Nuwa spoke calmly. Let me be alone here, to pass through the final journey. Surroundings fell silent for a moment. Then footsteps receded from near to far. Accompanied by the sound of the great door closing, the inside was separated from the outside. Nuwa reclined in his wheelchair, contemplating his final decision just made. He had not directly designated his successor as the next patriarch for another reason. He did not wish for the position of patriarch to always be appointed by the predecessor. In the face of a major crisis, a strong leader is the best choice for handling everything. But in times of peace and stability, having more people involved in decision-making may delay the execution of many matters. It also helps to prevent the worst outcomes. Nuwa could not guarantee that every future leader of Silver Moon City would be wise and valiant, so it was better to have more voices in the mix. He could already envision that even if the new patriarch ultimately emerged victorious, those bishops who had competed against him would not be without a say. There likely would not be another leader who could make unilateral decisions like Nuwa. Every decision would need the support of others. The outcome most people can accept may not be the best, but it certainly won't be the worst. What happens after that is beyond my understanding. He murmured to himself, his voice echoing endlessly in the spacious hall. But then Nuwa seemed to notice something and tilted his head slightly. In a corner of the hall, a familiar old friend had been standing for a long time. He was holding a stone tablet in his hand and etching something onto it with his fingers. Without using any tools, the strokes of his fingertips left marks on the stone. Watching this scene, Nuwa couldn't help but smile slightly. He had heard the other talk about this before. In the very ancient past, he had bid farewell to another friend in the same way. You only called for the priests and didn't invite the wizards from the White Tower to come. It seems you still have some reservations about them." When Nuwa heard the other ask in such a manner, he replied casually, "Technically, I should state, I already saw them yesterday, and today I am only dealing with internal church affairs which do not concern them. But to tell the truth, I don't have any complaints against them, but I see that they probably won't always be with us. The witchcraft of Silver Moon City will not vanish, nor will the church become enemies with the wizards, but I think they won't stay here forever, especially the most capable among them. They have their own pursuits. Although I don't quite understand them, I do understand somewhat." Leaning back in his chair, feeling his last bits of vitality gradually ebbing away, Nuwa did not see any angels descending suddenly. However, he wasn't surprised by this, because during their last encounter, he had expressly requested a death as ordinary as any other. "Let it be so, I have done enough, and the rest is for those who come after me. Perhaps 1,000 years from now, someone stepping into this temple will speak of me, speaking of the first prophet who died here. To be honest, although I don't consider myself very wise, truth be told, I do quite like the title prophet. When I first heard people using it, I was a little pleased inside." His voice grew weaker, and his eyes lost their sparkle. In the corner of the temple, the person etching the stone tablet quietly watched this scene and then gave a heartfelt affirmation. "Your experiences will become an epic, Nuwa. 1,000 years later, people will still sing of your history. 10,000 years later, you will be revered as a myth." A myth? Like you? That does sound rather nice." His voice faded into indistinctness until it ceased altogether. The next moment, a massive bell tolled throughout Silver Moon City. Though they had not witnessed it themselves, everyone knew. The prophet was dead, he had returned to the embrace of the divine. And with him, his era had also come to an end. Chapter 510, Illusion. A blanket of darkness. The feeling of death was so peculiar, as if something unstoppable was being drawn out of the body bit by bit. Perception of the surroundings gradually faded away, replaced by an endless cold. It was like walking naked through heavy snow, with nothing to shield you from the bone-chilling cold. For a moment, Nuwa felt he had lost the ability to move. He could only silently watch, watching his own body slumped on the throne inside the temple, watching people who had just left returning to mourn in front of his corpse. He should have reacted even if they could no longer notice him. But like a person just awakened from deep sleep, though everything before his eyes was seen, Nuwa's thoughts seemed still immersed in haze, incapable of any contemplation. So he just quietly observed as they conducted a succinct and solemn ceremony, saw them carry away his corpse, and then in front of the temple announced his last will to the inhabitants of Silver Moon City. The crowd outside the temple was a sea of people, where even the smallest voice would become noisy when amplified by such a multitude. Yet the voice that read out the will passed unobstructed to everyone's ear, clearly conveying his message. Then the crowd parted to both sides under an invisible force, and Nuwa's remains were carried straight out of the city along the central avenue. He would be buried alongside his former companions, declaring his social death. Though momentarily disoriented, Nuwa's soul still drifted away with them. He listened to the discussions of those around him, passed through streets and alleys, and continued outward until he saw with his own eyes his body being buried in the prepared graveyard. Then, as if the last shackle to reality was broken, he felt a mysterious pulling force emanating from below, and the source of that suction was the unknowable river of oblivion. What a surprise! Hey, who would have thought it would turn out like this? Competing for power without the patriarch, relying on my own skills? That's pretty good. This means, no matter what, expansion is imperative. I've wanted to go out and see for so long. Kanios couldn't really describe his feelings as he watched the procession pass along the central avenue. But when he searched his heart, he felt a touch happier. After all, he acknowledged Nuwa as a great leader, not for what he had done, but for what he hadn't done. He had no family, no descendants, because he did not want the so-called bloodline of the prophet to continue. He gave up the immortal life that was within easy reach, which, on top of not understanding it, made Khanios respect him. Humans are such beings, adoring those who are similar to themselves yet can do what they cannot. Even the wise are no exception. But since emotions cannot be fully shared between people, the young man simply felt some regret watching this unfold. Compared to all of that, he was more concerned about the changes that the death of the great prophet would bring. Like the youth's longing for the unknown and battle finally becoming attainable, and possible changes in Silver Moon City. The life and death of those important figures weren't really related to him, or so he thought. Khanios, I know you're distracted, but at least try to look a bit more serious. An annoyed voice came from ahead, snapping Khanios back to attention. Looking at the girl who was standing on tiptoe, peering into the distance, he inexplicably said, Deo, I'm envisioning the future. Maybe one day, I'll have a city mourn my departure too. Really? Glancing sideways, the girl pursed her lips. Then I shall look forward to that day, esteemed Lord Khanios. Indeed, just like she had always hoped, he might join the exploration team of the new Archbishop, Damien. But Deo had no plans to go. She wanted to stay because her dream was to study divine arts and become a priest, not to engage in battles and killings, which she saw as boys' hobbies. It seemed like they were about to part ways, but the lifespan of Silver Moon City's inhabitants was a bit longer, so even a pioneering journey that might last a decade or more would not be a farewell. Therefore, Deo simply waved her hand, somewhat celebrating her childhood companion's wish being fulfilled. That day will surely come, but when that day arrives, I'll reluctantly permit you to keep calling me by my name. As if inspired, Khanios couldn't help but puff out his chest a bit. Although strictly speaking, even he didn't quite believe he could achieve it, but what if? Anything was possible, as the Church's scriptures also said. God spoke that nothing was immutable in the world. The only constant was change itself. So if that was the case, there probably wasn't anything that couldn't happen. So who was to say he couldn't make a big difference someday? The conversation faded, and both were lost in their own thoughts. Along the central avenue, the procession moved towards the city's outskirts, and the crowd surged accordingly. Until the long night passed, peace still did not return to Silver Moon City. This was the beginning, but it would not be the end. This human city, once tucked away in a corner of the continent, would also return to its rightful position.